Okay, once again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining our workshop today. Today, our topic is attack on immobile pawns. I'm going to explain what does it mean, how to attack such pawns, and by which means, and which benefits you can, of course, get by doing such attacks. So, first of all, well, the attack on the immobile pawns is a very important element of any chess strategy. The key idea is that the pawns cannot move, and it means that you can accumulate forces in order to destroy this pawn. And very often you attack it, force enemy pieces to defend it, and then undermine it with your pawn because they simply cannot capture your pawn because of some problems in case if the file becomes open, usually by tactical means. But even if there are no tactical means, just undermining this pawn makes a lot of sense. Well, I'll explain it a little bit later. So, what are these purposes of the attack of immobile pawn? Well, first, of course, you want to destroy this pawn, and because of that, you add pressure. Second, you may attack such a pawn in order to weaken the enemy pawn chain. What else? Well, you can tie enemy pieces down to this pawn. This makes sense too. And of course, we want to invade the enemy camp by blockading these pawns that cannot move. So what we should try to do? Of course, accumulate forces, like I said, initiate a pawn breakthrough or undermining this pawn, or exchange enemy pieces that do not allow us to achieve what we want. So let's start. Let's start with this position, the game between Akiba Rubinstein and Georg Salve. So what do you think we should play as white in this position? So what are your suggestions? What do you think? Okay, so I'm waiting for your comments. I'm reading your comments here in Zoom as well as on YouTube. Okay, so then suggest queen c2 and knight c5. Well, then if you want to play knight c5, you can. I'm sure you can play it right away. Because, well, you probably play queen c2 because you think the pawn is hanging, but no, the pawn is not hanging. Well, actually, yes, it is hanging, and if you want to do this extra defense, you should. But you may also sacrifice this pawn. What else? Bishop c5 to trade the bishops and occupy the c5 square with a rook. Well, fine, yes, it works. Well, okay, so you are on the right direction. That's definitely right. It's all about c5, and you have the control over this square. They cannot push. And well, doing queen c2 seems a little slow. If you want, you can play knight c5 right away, because if they decide to take here first, then their rook is hanging, so they have no time to capture on b2. So, but they may capture on b2 right away. And if that happens, you can capture on e6, f takes e6, rook takes c6, queen e2, rook takes e6, well, and they experience some issues in this position. The number of pawns is equal, but the position becomes more open. You can block enemy pieces by locating your bishop on d4, and your other bishop becomes active too. So here, with a bishop pair, you have really good chances to play for a win. What else? Well, if they take, you take, rook moves, and then just b3. This looks fine. And even if they try to chase your bishop away, it's not a big issue. Why? Because these are hanging pawns. And we know that hanging pawns are strong when there are a lot of minor pieces on the board. This time there are only few, and you have a bishop pair, by the way. Also, your bishops are located in such a way that doesn't offer any attack for your opponent. I mean, these pawns are not attacking the bishops. For example, c4, f4. You activate this bishop, you threaten to take. Well, don't blunder your bishop, but after queen d4, it's definitely possible. Well, they may not play it, but you're gonna play f4 anyway. This is the object of the attack. The knight goes to defend it, but you can simply capture the knight, for example. Well, it's tough. This doesn't make sense. If knight c5, they play bishop f5, for example, g4, and black has to take a critical decision where to make a bishop move, to c8 or to g6. If this move, then just bishop d4. You successfully protect on b2 and hold the blockade. Later, you may consider something like that, for example. Or even f4. But when you play f4, you weaken e4. Don't forget about it. If the bishop goes that way, then, well, b3 still seems to be okay, but queen b3 passing the game to the endgame looks more favorable. Okay, so what else? Let's go back. Let's go back. In the game, well, knight c5 is a playable move. Not the very best option, but playable. However, bishop c5 looks to be a better option. Why so? Because you keep the knight, and this knight works like a perfect blockading piece. So you exchange the enemy piece that stops you from from occupying the c5 with your knight, because the knight on c5 is a really well placed knight. It attacks a lot of squares into the enemy territory. Well, they didn't take. If they did take, you're right, you take with a rook, queen goes to b7, then you defend there, maybe with b3, maybe with queen c2, and add pressure on c6. And you can always retreat with the rook back, occupying the square with a knight, for example. Let's go back. So rook f e8 was played. Now what? Well, we occupied c5. Should we take on e7 and then occupy c5? Because just getting the control over the c5 square doesn't allow us to win. However, we should definitely do it, but it seems that we can do it at almost any moment. What would you suggest? By the way, I didn't say it before, but if this is your first time participating in my Sundays workshops, please introduce yourself a little. For example, tell me what your current ELO is. It can be either FIDE rating or any online rating, for example, on chess.com, and which country you're from. So not much information, just to understand what is the level of and the geography of our students. Okay. John suggests rook f2 to reposition the queen to d4. John, you want to protect the pawn. That's the reason, right? Well, rook f2 is a good move, actually. And I absolutely agree with you. And this is what was played. However, the idea of this move is not only to protect on e2. This move illustrates a very beautiful reorganization of white forces. The rooks can be doubled on the c file, so I believe that e3 will be played soon. Second, the bishop goes to f1, which allows us to drive the queen away, either with e3 or maybe with more aggressive e4. But you should be accurate with e4, because, well, even if you play so e4, and then what? Will you exchange the e pawn for the c pawn by doing this exchange? What's the purpose? So that's why e4 is a bit suspicious, because then your pawn will be hanging on e4, or you have to exchange, or you have to put e5. All these decisions are responsible. That's why I would prefer playing e3. Anyway, the game continued with this, so we don't want to give up to our bishop. So bishop takes e7, rook takes e7, and what now? e3. Logical. What's the purpose of e3? Because the pawn is not protected by anything there. Okay, so bishop f1, move the rook to the c file. Okay, the purpose of e3 is to bring the rook there or to play bishop f1. And you can actually play bishop f1 right away. Well, that's right. However, why you want to play e3 right away? So there is this move, and this move is important because it stops c5. So you don't have to calculate whether c5 this time is favorable for them or not. So, for example, e3, c5, what do you think about this position? You can play bishop f1 here, let's say, and then they maybe block with c4. Can you play b3 in this position? Yes, maybe you can, but are you sure it's promising? For example, b3, knight b6. If you take there, it seems they have enough defenders, and if you trade the knights, they are going to add pressure on a2. It's not hanging because there is a rook, but anyway, it's some pressure that you'd better avoid. Also, for example, they can take with a queen, and then e3 becomes vulnerable. Take, bishop takes, rook takes, simply queen e3. And maybe black is even better. So queen d4 first. You stop c5, and you can occupy this square with your pieces then. And b2 is protected. So rook goes to e8. Well, there is nothing to do on e7. Bishop f1, the rook goes that way. And this time, what do you think? e3 or e4? What is better? e4 looks very attractive because it's an attack. It's an attack here. So e3 seems to be a little passive. But, well, okay. So Brian prefers e4. Who else can suggest anything? So e4 or e3? e4. Maybe knight c5 first. e3. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you for your answers. I'm looking at all answers, so even on YouTube. By the way, if you're watching this video on YouTube, can you please like it? This will help us to promote this video to more chess students. So e3. e3 is better than e4. Why so? Because e4 seems to be more logical, right? But again, so what do you want to achieve with this move? Yes, you, well, you didn't attack d5. d5 is protected enough. You moved your pawn twice, I mean, 2 squares. Now, after queen b7, what do you decide? e5. What's the purpose? If you play e5, well, they can just ignore it. And now you have to keep an eye on this pawn. For example, they play queen b8, you have to play f4. Maybe f4 favors you, actually. Okay, maybe they play g6. And then try to hold the blockade with this move. And what f4 allows you to do? You want to take? Well, this only improves their position. Now there is no weakness on c6, and you can hardly fight for the c5 square. Well, you can occupy it, but what did you achieve with this? That's why e3, because with e3, we can keep the idea of playing e4 later if we really want it. Moreover, we keep the c6 pawn where it is and do not allow c5. Well, right now c5 is just the queen hanging. So the queen moves, and now we play knight c5. So we can compare, for example, e4, queen b7, take, and knight c5 in this position. So knight takes, rook takes. What did we achieve? They can take, or they may play something more helpful, like even g6, for example. Well, this position isn't better for white. Or let's say they take first, then play with the rook, queen goes back, and now they play g6. What did you achieve? So having the pawn on c6 is more disadvantages for black. That's why it does make sense for us to not play e4 and not exchange pawns. e3, activating the bishop, queen b7, and knight c5. So because it's a triple attack, so they have to trade. Rook c7, rook fc2, adding pressure, queen b6. Well, what do you think should be our next stage? So for those of you who joined us a little later, I would like to explain that today we are going to talk about, and we are already talking about, attack on immobile pawns. So the pawns that can move, or, well, the pawns that can technically move, but this leads to some troubles, some drawbacks of their position. For example, the pawns become easy targets, or maybe there are some other tactical issues. So here the c6 pawn is blockaded. But is it enough? Okay, Brian suggests a4, a5, kind of a positional grip. It does make sense, but if you play a4, they will play a5. Or maybe you have a tactical solution for this. So b4 seems to be more logical. So you control c5, you fix the pawn, and a5 is also not a possibility this time. What's wrong with a5? For example, if you play a4, like Brian suggested, a5 works. But if you play b4 and they play a5, a5 completely fails. b5. Well, yeah, then you are right. b5 works too, but there is a better move. So b5, taking advantage of the pin, definitely is a good idea. What else? Can you find a tactical solution? Rook b2. No, rook b2 is not a tactical solution. So rook b2, they can take maybe on b4. Okay, Carlos. Kertik suggests bishop b5, and Carlos suggests rook takes a5. Thanks, Carlos. Can you please tell me what's your elo? Rook a5. Yeah, this is a very nice tactical strike. It works better than rook c6 because, well, rook c6, and the queen is protected. But rook a5, queen is not protected. Capturing on a5 with a queen is impossible. And if queen takes queen, there is intermediate check. Well, it's just a check, it's not checkmate. So bishop c8, e takes d4, white wins the rook. Oh, wow, you're almost 1950 on chess.com. That's great. Yes, it's rook a5. Well, in the game, they played a6. And I have a question, what we should do? A4. Okay, a4 is possible. Not the best option. So remember, b4 fixes these two weaknesses. And our task is to attack them. Once we win one of them, it's almost a completely winning position. Bishop d3, what's the purpose of bishop d3? Just to activate your bishop, it's kind of a waiting move. b5, what if they take? Well, would you... No, you take with a bishop, it's possible. Yeah, you can take with the bishop. So b5 makes sense, actually. b5, a takes, bishop takes. But, well, what did you achieve? You're going to take there, but it's not an easy task. Let's say this. And then I'm going to take on a2. If rook c6, I'll take the queen first, then exchange on c6 and take on a2. For example, this, pawn takes, rook takes. So if rook takes, then rook takes a2. This move, threatening a mate. A bit complicated for me. Okay, let's say king f8 or g6. Let's say g6. And then after this, I think it's bishop h3. And with such a king, you don't have a chance to win, play for a win. There is a check, and there will be always mating threats. So, for example, rook c5, check. Well, this fails. This means that there is this move, and the rook has to go to the back rank to defend. But then rook d4, and at least black is not losing. Maybe you can include g4, but if g4, it's bishop e6. Okay, fine. So right now, taking on c6 doesn't lead to a winning position. Queen c3 instead to add pressure on c6 makes sense, but they will defend it. Not with this move, because you can take on d5. No, I don't think it's possible. If you take on d5, queen takes, it's queen e3. And the number of pawns is equal. Instead, yeah, rook a5. Thanks, Zamfir. This is actually the best move. But let's talk about other options too. So b5 was a possibility. Bishop d3 is a possible move if you're looking for a waiting move. And there is also this move. Well, this move makes sense. But remember that this can be a weakness. For example, what if he plays that? Do you have to play b5 then? Okay, what if they play this move? And if you take there, they take on b4. So doing this move is a little risky. So this, for example, well, if queen takes, then there is a pawn hanging, so maybe rook a6 right away. Rook takes rook, there is no back rank checkmate. So this move, queen takes, pawn takes, and then this, so there is no back rank mate, and these are targets. So white is unlikely to win this. Well, in the game it was rook a5, but I also wonder, what about this move? Isn't it a move that wins a pawn? What's your opinion? So, well, we attack the queen, and if they take our queen, we are able to save the rook. Well, we are also threatening with a back rank mate. I don't think c5 is possible because of that. Well, in the game, Akiba Rubinstein played this move, which was absolutely correct. Rook d5 is a mistake, and I want you to find why this move is a mistake. In which line white may experience issues? It's not a losing move, but the position is not winning. Thanks, John. It's absolutely right. It's c takes d5, queen takes b6, and rook c2. So now, well, white is down a rook. They have to take the queen. Then it's actually an exchange of the queen for two rooks. It's possible to take on a6 then, but then rook a2. Maybe queen b7 instead. Well, just bringing the rook and defending the position seems to be okay, but I want to develop some initiative. So let's say this, then this, threatening, well, something like checkmate. It's not a checkmate, and of course, after doing this check, the next step is to create an escape square for the king, and then take advantage of that pin. But looks like black has enough compensation here with their rooks. They are able to stop white pawns. That's why not rook d5, rook a5. Rook a5, rook b8 attacking this, and now you see why white didn't play a4, because a4 doesn't allow white to play a3, but now a3 just defending there and blocking two pawns is the best solution. Well, this is a tough position. So, well, when you make pawn moves, remember that the pawns do not move back. So, for example, e4, having e4 wouldn't allow you to have your queen on d4 defended. And this exchange is always favorable for you because he can hardly attack your pawn on d4, but your pawn on d4 stops the c pawn movements. Even if you manage to undermine the c pawn by doing a4 b5, c5 won't be a possibility for him because you have rook and pawn. And same situation here. Once you played a4, you won't have a pawn defending b4. So a3, and in these tough positions, black overlooked a tactical strike. So, but it's hard to suggest. What can he do? For example, can he play this move? What do you think? No, well, I played this move in order to defend a6. Well, if bishop c8, well, a6 is defended, but there are other disadvantages of the black's position. Let's find them and exploit them. Yes, you can play queen b6. It's probably the simplest solution. Queen b6, rook b6, and then rook d5. Because now he doesn't invade your camp and doesn't attack your pawn. So you're a pawn up, and most likely you win another pawn too. Fine. Doing rook d5 also makes sense, because if they play so you take on b6, it's basically the same position. They cannot take on c2 because you checkmate with queen d8, or take the rook on b8, for example. So either rook d5 or exchange queens, which is more straightforward. Queen e5 instead, what's the purpose? Threatening mate and pinning? Well, yes, but g6, let's say. You do not achieve much. Yeah, rook d5 or queen b6 and then rook d5 makes sense. Well, they played this move, but it's hard to suggest a move. What else they can play? If they exchange queens, then how do they defend a6? Okay, I got the point. So that's why what they played was rook a7. But they missed a simple tactical strike. Who can find this tactical strike, by the way? It seems that they have everything protected, but it was a mistake. So, well, this is what typically happens in calm games. So, step by step, you improve your position, create threats, and create targets in the enemy camp, attack them, tie enemy pieces down, but the game ends with a tactical strike anyway. Yes, it's rook takes c6. So rook takes c6, and if queen takes c6, you take on a7. If queen takes d4, well, then pawn takes queen, and you are pawn up, and a6 also falls. So queen takes is the best option. Queen a7, the b8, rook is hanging. So rook a8 with a tempo. You cannot take there. No, actually, No, you cannot take there because they take here this and this. And you're pawn up, but it's e3 is hanging, so it's not such a clear position. That's why simply queen c5 to leave this pawn where it is, because both pawns, the c6 and a6, are the objects of the attack. So we capture on c6, then our goal is to capture the other pawn left. Queen b7. What happens then? King f2, simply. Why? Well, it's a move that improves the position, brings the king to the place of action, because white is likely to pass the game to the endgame. It also defends the pawn on e3, while the enemy pieces are too far from the king side, and even doing like that makes no sense. Okay, there is a suggestion of playing b5. Well, it's not a sacrifice actually, but what do you achieve with this move? A takes, then what? Rook takes. Well, definitely possible, but why b5 if our goal is to win the pawn on a6? So g6, queen d6, queen c8, rook c5, queen goes back, and h4, stopping enemy pieces. Now the next move can be this, after which the pawn is vulnerable. So they played a5. What would you suggest here? Just take the pawn. With which piece? With your pawn or with your rook? I'm sure it's possible to capture on a5 and it's still a winning position, but well, you have two passed pawns and both of them are edge pawns. Yeah, that's why it's better to play b5 just. Well, in the game it was rook c7 and then b5. So queen moves, then b5 was played. a4, otherwise you protect it. So a4, b6, rook a5, and after b7 he simply resigned because rook c8 is coming. Could he stop it somehow? No. This, blunder. This, blunder. Could the queen go anywhere else after this move? No. b8 is the only square. So b5, b6, b7, rook c8 is simply a winning plan. There is not much that he could do. He could try to move the king to the 7th rank, but imagine the situation when you, well, let's say advance the pawn, the king is on the 7th rank, you just simply do this and take the queen. Well, Kiba Rubinstein was, well, he was not only a good attacker, he was good in positional play, as well as Mikhail Botvinnik, for example. So what did happen in this game? We blockaded the pawn on c6 by occupying the square. The idea of such a bishop move was to exchange bishops and set our knight on c5, which allows us to control the squares into the enemy territory, as well as allows us to prevent any counterplay from our opponent, but to improve or consolidate our forces on the queen side to add more pressure on the pawn on c6. Later in the game, the a6 pawn becomes our target too. So for example, once a6 was played, it became our target and we played this. Now two pawns are hanging, and despite that our opponent has a bishop, we managed to win these pawns. Also, there is a resource that we didn't try, which was a6 b5. I'm not saying you should do it right away, but if, for example, well, the queens were exchanged, then this could be a possibility. Right now, it's not even required because you have a simple rook d5 move, which allows you to win a pawn based on this pin. Fine. However, this is not the only example when we attack immobile pawns. So look at this position. What do you think? Which opening did it appear from? And while you're thinking, let me tell you a little more about the conditions which favor the attack on immobile pawn or pawns. Well, the center should be fixed or stable. Our pieces should have some liberty in the coordination, so we shouldn't experience issues connecting our pieces, and we should have pawns to undermine. Well, our attack on immobile pawn is stronger if there are weaknesses in the enemy pawn structure. For example, like it was in the previous game, a6 and c6 were both weaknesses. And well, for example, if the king is closer to the pawns, we can combine ideas of the attacking pawns and attacking the king. But this is not the point of this concrete example. So let me read your comments. So Kertik suggests that this was London, then thinks it was Slav. John says it was Queen's Gambit. Brian says London. Dikshant suggests London. Carlos Slav or semi-Slav. Queen's Gambit declined. London is more popular in our time, not so in the past. Probably Semislav. Come on, guys. It was just Queen's Gambit declined, Carlsbad variation. This pawn structure is called Carlsbad. c4 was exchanged for the d5, or c4 was exchanged for the pawn on e6. And c6 could be played earlier, so the game could start with Slav defense or semi-Slav defense, but usually it's just Queen's Gambit declined and c6 was played later. Once c takes d5 and e takes d5 happen. So this is one of the most important types, or I would say structures of the position. And you may, if you in any of your games play d4 or d5, you may meet it either like this or with colors reversed. So I played it so many times, and nowadays I also get it. In London, it can be, you can get it with colors reversed, for example. Well, can it be London? Quite unlikely, because in London there is a pawn on c3, and very rare the pawn goes on c4. So, well, technically it could be London, but no, it's not. Okay, so Queen's Gambit declined, Carlsbad system. Bartholomew suggests f5. For black, f5, f4. Well, definitely sounds like a good plan. But what do you think white should be doing? If any of you play d4, you should be familiar with common plans for white in this position, in this type of a pawn structure. Also, there is a course where I explain how to come up with a plan depending on the pawn structure. And Carlsbad pawn structure, because it's so popular, is covered too. So I'm talking about planning guide for club players. There is a course on my website. So white should prepare e4. This is what Brian suggests. Well, Brian, my congratulations, you suggest the third popular plan. So playing e4, yes, deserves attention. It's not considered to be the strongest option, but it's definitely possible, and some players prefer doing this plan. h7 is a weakness? No, I wouldn't say so. There is a knight, and this knight goes to g6, and you don't have pieces to attack, only these two. So even if they just play g6 or h6, what then? Well, people also play f3, e4. Good point. Kasparov played a game where he prepared e4. That's right, but his knight was on e2. That's why playing f3, e4 was much easier for him. And f3, e4 is the best plan for white in Carlsbad. So this is not only my opinion, it's, well, this is what chess players think nowadays. For example, 20 years before, the concept was completely different. People thought that the minority attack is the best plan, but f3 e4 is the best. Well, it shows better statistics, better winning chances for white. But this time you already have a knight here, so doing f3 e4 will be a bit problematic for you. Also, once you do e4, you let the enemy knight to go to f4. So doing f3 e4 is good when there is a bishop on g5 and the knight on e2. Here it requires too many tempi. That's why here white decides to initiate the second popular plan, and probably the second strongest plan, the minority attack with b4 and a4 and b5. So he plays b4. What's the purpose of, what's the goal of this minority attack? Well, the idea is that we either want to exchange these pawns and make the b7 pawn a weakness, or it can be b5 and b takes c6 and c6 pawn becomes a weakness. Two options, and then we will attack it directly through the open files. Anyway, well, f5 cannot be played at the moment, it's just a pawn blunder, so bishop e6 was played. Just a move that allows to support d5. Well, to be honest, I'm not a big fan of the black's setup. If I were playing this position, what I would try to do, well, I wouldn't play knight f8, I wouldn't play knight h5. I would try to keep one knight on e4 and support this knight with my other knight. And then I, as black, can initiate the attack on the enemy king because of the control over e4. And very often in such positions, well, it was, let me just show you. Queen b2 was played in order to push a4 because the b4 pawn is hanging then. Now with the queen on b2, it's not. So rook a d8, a4. So it's protected, and b5 is coming. In such positions, I would prefer playing b5 with black pieces, so that I, as black, can be prepared for this pawn march. So, for example, take, and then with my knights here and there, I can quickly regroup pieces and occupy c4 with the knight, blocking the c file, so making c6 not such a weakness. However, in this position, b5 is impossible. If you play so after knight e5, you are likely to experience serious issues with the pawn on c6 because your knight are not coordinated and you don't have them neither on d6 nor on e4. Fine, let's continue. Well, black should do the attack on the king side. What else? So that's why they play g5. b5 anyway. A takes b5, a takes b5, g4. Well, why this? Because a6 is already hanging. g5, knight goes to d2. It seems like an attack, but at the same time, our position is not compromised. They don't have a light dark squared bishop to attack h2. Okay, so let me answer Brian's question. If white queen was better placed and the knight was on e5, let's say this knight was on e5, there could be a sacrifice on h7. No, I don't think so. There is a knight on f8, and that's why any sacrifice wouldn't work. What do you think? Well, knight d2 was finally played. The game here continued with this move. Well, why this move? I think they are planning g3. So g3, h takes, knight takes, f takes, and then queen e3, winning the bishop back, winning the minor piece back. But would you suggest a better option for black instead of just playing bishop c8? What do you think? Eros suggests g2. What do you mean? Bartholomew suggests c5. Ah, you mean g3 might work, not g2, g3. Well, looks interesting. So after bishop c8, it might work, true. Well, the other suggestion is f5. Well, f5. Let's talk about f5. So how do we play against this move? Well, b takes c6, b takes c6, and then maybe knight e2. It's not a defensive move. We are adding pressure, and then we are about to play this, so it's a weakness. The best way... Queen g5 to target a3. No, it's not the best way, but just let's discuss it. So let's say take. For example, I play knight e2, and then knight here, so e3 is safe. Bishop d7 defending it. Maybe just rook c3 to have some extra defense, and then knight g3. No, I don't think it's so promising for you. Now this is a weakness, and it will be attacked. Knight b3, knight a5, or knight b3, knight c5. So this knight defends the king side, and the d knight goes to the queen side. So the best way is actually to play c5. Why so? b7 is not such a weakness. For example, d takes. Well, if queen takes e5, then with knight e2, you have a very nice blockade, and your pieces are better. But after c5, they can play d4. Pawn takes, rook takes, attacking the bishop. Bishop moves, and queen c5 this time. There is no promising move to initiate a discovered attack. For example, like that fails because of queen b4. And it seems that we have to exchange the queen. There is this move, but you are not attacking h7. So once the queens are exchanged, black experiences some issues, to be honest. But these are not such a trouble that they finally got into when they played bishop c8. So here they are under pressure and have to defend the position. So this is a threat. And even if it was protected, this and knight f6 becomes a threat. So they have to stop such an attack. f5, but knight d6 is a double attack. However, after rook d8, there is a pin. So you have to play knight dc4 or something like that. And now there is a problem with this. And what else? b7 is a problematic pawn. So not so easy for black to defend the position then. But c5 was anyway the best option. However, it was a little hard for Akiba Rubinstein, who this time was playing with black pieces, to calculate all that stuff. Bishop c8, this is what he played. Rook f e1. So you remember I was playing rook c3 to protect on e3. Here he played this prophylaxis in order to support there, as well as bring the knight to f1. So f5, knight to a2. Attacking c6 and aiming to move his knight to b4. Rook d6, defending a weakness. Pawn takes, and queen b6, adding pressure. Bishop d7. So white, was there a knight f4? No. Knight f4 was never possible. So you exchange your queen for two rooks, but don't forget that before that you exchanged your, you sacrificed your knight. So it's queen and the minor piece versus two rooks. Bishop d7, defending, knight b4, attacking, and looks like they don't have any ideas of how to defend, so they can try rook c8 move. But it doesn't work. There is a rook bishop a6 which chases the rook away, after which the pawn on c6 can be captured. So that's why they played knight f6. Now it's possible to take on c6. For example, once you take, what may happen? Yeah, queen e6 can happen, and now white experiences some issues with the knight being pinned. Well, actually, there is a tactical strike. There is bishop f5. well, they cannot take on c6 and attack our queen because their queen is hanging with a check. So here they have to take. And then it's knight e7, sacrificing the second minor piece, but winning a rook. So it's two minor pieces for rook and two pawns. But this is a little unclear. So maybe white is better, but just a little. That's why they don't take on c6 right away. Rook c2. Intending to double. Knight e4, so, well, in order to not blunder anything, like this or that immediately, we should trade. And we should trade the bishop, because our knight, in such a case, will do some defensive functions on f1. So now we have enough pressure, so capturing on c6 becomes possible, but that's why they defended. And if we take, for example, now, it's rook e6, and we are in trouble. So that's why let's move the queen, and then we're threatening to take. Rook e7. Again, taking here makes a discovered attack. So queen e8. Rook f7, attacking there, so no time to take on c6. Knight f1. So this is our minimal and at the same time sufficient defense. With knight f1, we bring the rook to defend f2, as well as defend h2 and g3 squares. So we minimize enemy activity on the king side with just one knight. Well, what they have to do? Advance their pawns and sooner or later play g3. Knight g3. So this is hanging. The idea of this move has some tactical idea behind. So knight h5, queen g5, queen b8 attacking the rook, and once this rook moves, it's knight f4. So this knight from f4 does more defensive functions rather than the knight on f1. Well, now they decided to sacrifice the pawn by doing this. Could they defend it? Yes, they could. They could try to defend it with rook f6. If so, we would continue the game with this move. And then knight c5, so we are not afraid of opening the position there. It's not a big issue. Because then we invade the enemy side from the enemy camp on the queen side, and their king becomes weak to h3, g3. If now they want to win, they have to bring their queen to g2 and at the same time liquidate our knight, which is not possible. So queen g4, but who cares? We can just activate our rook to a7 or maybe rook a8. Queen f3 isn't a big issue. Actually, maybe rook f1 here. Or just queen d8, something like that. And if they play queen f3, we can play g4 and then rook g1. So this is interesting. This offers us some chances to defeat black quickly. So the game continued with g3. So they decided to play g3 and sacrifice the pawn there. And knight c6. So finally, there was a weakness on c6 and white managed to take it. Black was relying on some counterplay, but there is no counterplay. Now, if rook takes, then the c6 knight is, of course, under attack. That's why king takes. Bishop takes c6, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and h3. So I don't know what he was relying on. Probably he thought that the queen invades the enemy camp like that. But after g takes h3, it's not possible. g4 is not available. Is h5 available? Well, no, it's not. I was thinking about this move, but it seems to be blunder. Okay, fine. Let's just play this move. Queen f3, king d2. He can deliver a check, but this time I block and it can be hardly attacked. And then if I only exchange the queens, I'm simply 2 pawns up. And d5 is a weakness, by the way. So after g takes h3, there are no chances. Probably this move would be better. would lead to a better scenario for black. Here I think they have some compensation. So for example, king e1 here, here, and this. So this is a little unclear. But once the pawn is liquidated, no, rook g6 doesn't win. Rook g6 doesn't win a queen, so because there is a pin. So g takes h3, this is where the game ended. Black realized that they have no chances to survive. So the minority attack is very common, and you may meet it in many positions, especially against London, especially in Queen's Gambit declined, if you prefer to play Carlsbad pawn structure. So think about this plan. It makes b7 a weakness or makes c6 a weakness. In this, our example, we made c6 a weakness and we were able to capture that pawn. Fine. Now let's continue. Our third example. Well, where else we can find the attack on the enemy immobile pawns? Well, Carlsbad, yes. King's Indian. In the King's Indian, in classical variation of King's Indian, white does c4, b4, c5, and takes on d6. Those of you who play King's Indian definitely know about that. So, and then the pawn on d6 is attacked. Well, in English opening, it can also be possible in terrace defense when there is an attack on c. When there is a knight on c6, this knight can be exchanged and this pawn is the object of the attack. So there are a lot of openings. And if you want to learn how to better take advantage of these weaknesses, well, you may take a look at the games of Botvinnik, Smyslov, or Rubinstein. And well, the other suggestion is just to practice. If only you see that your opponent has pawns that can hardly move, try to attack them using the means that we learned on this workshop. Okay, so white to move. What do you think? What white should be doing here? I'm sure that those of you who attend our group lessons, how to attack and defend in chess, may definitely say the answer. May definitely find the answer. So right now your answers are b3. So b3 was suggested by Bartholomew. Not sure. b3, so what's the purpose? If b takes, you want to take with the b pawn. Why so? I would prefer taking with the d pawn. d6 is a weakness. It's on the open file. And your b3 pawn, if in case if this happens, if you finally decide to play b3, is not an object of the attack. Okay, so, well, it's not a stone wall, but no, it's not stone wall. Okay, so then attends our group classes, and he first suggested rook g1, g4. Right, but maybe g4 first. Kartik suggests g4, g5. Well, you should be prepared for g5, but g4, definitely yes. How do I decide that white should start the attack on the king side? Well, white has a material majority. These pieces are targeting the king side. And the center is stable. Just two conditions that are met tell us that white should attack on the king side. Trade light squared bishop. Well, what for? This bishop isn't, well, they both are bad. But yes, I would prefer to exchange bishops. However, if you should understand that by exchanging bishops, you provide your opponent with more room to maneuver with his other pieces left. And here, white definitely has more space. That's why black experiences issues when he tries to transfer pieces from one side to the other side or the place of action. So that's why trading pieces is more favorable for black. But yes, I would love to exchange these bishops. However, I don't see much benefits that it offers for white. My bishop can participate in the attack. Can this bishop participate in the defense? Well, maybe through e8, but it means that the knight doesn't go to e8 then. So attacking on the king side seems to be the best plan. This, g4, f6 is our target. It's immobile and we are going to play this. In case of this exchange, we can operate through the open file. Not so obvious because black is going to defend. So knight e8 was played, for example. Well, queen g2. Rook g1 is possible too. So maybe rook g1 is a better move than queen g2. But look, if this we take with the d, b2 is protected. So they played queen d8. Rook e2. So he defends with a rook and intends to move the other rook to g1. a5. Well, what black should do? Their pieces are awkward and they are trying to develop some initiative on the queen side and ideally open the position there. So that's the reason why we even don't play b3, because b3 allows them to play a4 and try to open the position there. f4 and bishop h6. G5. Okay, g5. Okay, fine. So rook g1 was played first, rook b7, either to double or to defend the 7th rank, and queen h3. So each move of white add more pressure to the enemy position, preparing for the g4, g5. Queen b8. Bishop goes back to c1, bishop d8. Knight goes to g2. Why the knight goes to g2? Well, we want to use our h pawn, and the knight can occupy d5. I'm not so sure that we should exchange such a good knight for this bishop, but maybe yes. Or maybe we play g5 and bring the knight to g4. This is the second option. Rook goes there. It's hard to suggest a plan. b2 is protected. They almost have no initiative on that side of the board. I mean, not initiative, but a counter play on that side of the board. Knight e3, h6. Knight d5 was played, finally. Well, this is... I would argue playing this move or not. So I would, for example, bring the queen back and instead try to play h4, g5. But the white player, who was Richard Reti this time, he was actually playing against Ernst Grunfeld. So he decided to play knight d5. Well, they didn't take immediately. They first exchanged there and then they took. Taking there right away would probably keep the position more closed. Bishop h6 doesn't become a threat. Why you always say so? There are two rooks on the 7th rank, so if needed, they can defend the position. So you should be very accurate with such a sacrifice. If, let's say, there was a pawn on c7 and this pawn was blocked, then yes, I would agree with you that bishop h6 and it absolutely destroys the pawn cover over the king. Yeah, I would say it makes sense. But with two rooks being on the 7th rank, no. Most likely you have to play g5. Anyway, so b takes, d takes, they took. This exchange doesn't change the course of events. So white should keep playing on the king side and should initiate g5, which he finally did. So queen f1, king f7, and h4. Well, they are trying to evacuate the king. This is a very common defensive technique. However, it means that once it happens, it means that white can get a chance to invade the enemy camp with their major pieces. So rook h2. Rook e8. Well, it's hard to suggest a move. Bishop d1, threatening with this move. That's why a4. It restricts the bishop. And what now? So this is not a threat. b3 then. Should we play b3 ourselves? Well, I don't see the point. It only opens the position on the queen side, potentially offering a counterplay for black. What would you suggest here? What do you think? So Kartik thinks it's time to play g5. By the way, can you please tell me what's your current elo on chess.com is and which country you are from? Because g5 does make sense. So it seems that white pieces are already prepared for that. Is it a pawn sacrifice? No, it's not. But I'm not saying that we should capture on g5 immediately. Okay, so FIDE is 1451. Okay, good. So g5, well, they took with the h. They could take with the f pawn, then bishop h5. So knight f6 maybe. Doing something like that isn't promising. Well, white isn't promising. So let's say we take on e8, then we try to win it with this move. Maybe they play bishop f6. But this time, actually, bishop h6 works. We can take advantage of that. And the g7 falls. So, okay, so h takes g5. H takes g5. Now the h file is open, so we are threatening with this move. Queen a7. Well, to move the queen away from the back rank, as well as evacuate the king to a safer position. But rook h8. And now moving the king is impossible. Bishop e7, defending the knight. And what would you suggest here? Bishop h5, I agree. Well, queen h3 is also a possibility. Queen h3, queen a6, let's say. Defend. Knight c7. I don't think this is a threat, actually. Well, yes, it's a pin, but if once he does this move, he's likely to face with other issues like queen here, for example. Anyway, rook h7, and it seems that we can capture there. So even knight e8, queen h5. So queen f7, then we take, or maybe queen e6, and then we take. It looks like they are in a big issue because queen, if the queen gets on e6 and the king goes there, then rook h8 becomes already a problem. Yeah, so something like that. Rook h8, bishop h5 also. So this move, and then this move, and these two pieces will create a serious problem with the bishop, with the knight on e8. Fine. So queen h3 deserves attention. Bishop h5 was played instead. F takes g5, and now what? So queen h3 looks so attractive, right? But the problem of this move is that they can simply block on f6 with a knight or with a bishop. What would you suggest? f6 right away? Interesting. Bishop e8, then need to calculate the f6. Well, the problem is that you take, the rook takes, and the rook threatens to take your rook with a check. f6 right away. f6 right away makes sense, but then knight f6, and again this rook is hanging. So probably to save time, you can maybe you check first with queen f5, king c7 then. Then maybe you exchange. Queen takes, queen e6. How do they play? King b6, king b6, yeah, king b6. Bishop g5. Well, take on h5, queen e7. I think they can play queen h8 actually. And after you take on e7, it's king b. d6 is vulnerable. Okay, no, it should be a king evacuation first and then queen h8. And it seems a bit problematic for white because now their king is in the danger while this king is relatively safe. What you should try instead is to take on e8 with a rook. Well, if queen h3 right now, it's knight f6. You have to exchange the rooks, and this allows him to bring pieces. So that's why rook e8 first, and then queen h3, threatening with f6, as well as threatening to take later. So something like that, for example, fails. You do this, the king escapes. Then what's the best option? Take on e7. Let's take on g7. Rook g8, bishop f7. And if they do this, you win this rook. So what else to put? Bishop f6. But this time you can invade the enemy camp with your queen. Queen h8. King d7. Why he goes to d7? Can he go to f7? Well, yes, he can try. But bishop g5, let's say. Bishop takes, rook g7. If not, then I take, and then still rook g7. If the king takes, then I think it's rook g6, king f5, queen h5, and it leads to checkmate. So king escapes to d7. It's safer. Bishop g5 anyway. King escapes further. Bishop takes, rook g7. But it seems that black solved their problem. Now the king escaped. It's possible to deliver a check. King goes to a6. And what would you suggest in this position? Doesn't it mean that the game ends in a draw? You can take on d6 with a check, actually. Yeah, you can take on d6 with a check, then take on f6. Seems to be quite promising, but is there a better way to play? Pin with queen c8, okay, queen c8, maybe queen b6. Where is a win? So queen d6, queen b6. So white is a pawn up, so it should be winning. Take. Well, opponent game is completely losing for black, so they play this. And then rook e7, rook e6. Okay, this is an easy win, I think. Rook b2, rook e6, king a5. Take there. Not so clear, actually. Rook c5. Yeah, not so clear about this position. Should be winning, actually. Maybe it's a draw. What else? Rook b7. Yeah, this works. This works too. Oh, yeah, this is better, actually. Yeah, this is definitely better because the pawn in game is completely winning. This, and the king is tied down to the pawn on d6. So what you need to do is to bring your king to c3. Your king is tied down to the e pawn too. Well, it should be winning. King g2. Well, king a5 is not a possibility. So yes, you can play b4 and then get your. Well, it's winning, but it's hard. That's why instead of doing all these things, he simply does. Well, queen f6 is not possible because of rook g7. So he simply does queen e8 move, threatening with checkmate in case of rook takes. Or threatening with this check. And this is where black resigned. If, for example, king a5, simply queen c6. Queen b5 is interesting, but simply queen c6. Adding pressure on the pin. And the b is actually tied down to the b5, the b7 rook. If it takes this rook, queen b5 is checkmate. Takes on b2, loses the queen. So it's pinned to b5 and the queen too. You simply win a rook. This is how the game ended. How should you decide that you should play like that and advance pawns from the king? Well, because the preconditions of the king side attack were originally met. You have more material on the king side and the center is stable. So doing the attack there makes sense. And you can allow yourself to advance the pawns from your king because you have pieces defending your king and your opponent doesn't have his pieces to let them move to the king side quickly to attack your king. So because of that, you have a chance to do the attack. But how you can do the attack without g5? So doesn't matter which opening you play, but this is what you are likely to face. When the center is closed and you advance the pawns from the king, he tries to build a fortress with f6 and you are trying to undermine this pawn by doing g5 and opening the position of the enemy king. So this time it was just pure undermining. Okay, so we have one more game to analyze today. This is the end game, the game between Max Juve and Daniel Noteboom. However, before we proceed with this game, let me share my screen again and remind you that if you would like to donate, if you enjoy my webinars and would like to support me, there is an option to donate using PayPal. So I can share the link with you. It works easily. You can just click this button. Then you enter the amount you want to donate. It can be any 10 or like 15, 20, 50, any amount. Then you click PayPal. It redirects you to your PayPal account where you have to log in. Well, it's in Spanish for me because I'm in Argentina. And then money automatically are transferred to my PayPal account. So I would really appreciate it, and it helps me to prepare for the webinars better because I also pay my assistants for my assistant for his work. He is a FIDE master and he prepares some content for me. So he is sending me the games that I ask him to choose for a certain topic, and then I have to choose which games I would like to present on the webinar for you. So he also does a lot of work. Fine. Let's continue. The last example. So, well, it's a common position. I don't know which opening it appeared. Maybe it was King's Indian attack or Reti opening. Maybe it was English opening, by the way. White sized the open file. And now white is looking for the target in the enemy camp. So what I like about the white's position is that they have a bishop. You may say that this is not a good bishop because there are pawns located on the light squares and the bishop's attack is partially restricted. However, I'm sure you can find a way of how to take advantage of it. What would you suggest? Rook c6 looks like an option. Well, John, you are a very optimistic person. Sacrifice the rook for 2 pawns to be able to win exchange then. So you will be down a piece for 2 pawns. Okay, Alan suggests a nice idea, b4 and b5. This helps to get this bishop into the play. Well, bishop c6, come on, guys. Well, we are, well, of course, our topic today is how to attack immobile pawns, not something related to very nice tactical combinations. So it doesn't mean that there will be no tactics in the position. There can be, but well, you sacrifice a piece in the end game. What for? Do you have passed pawns that are far advanced that are advanced enough? No. Do you have attack on the king? No. Can you find any tactical motives that you can implement then? No. So that's why neither bishop e6 nor rook c6 won't work. Yeah, neither of them works. So yeah, b4 with the pawn looks logical, but because you suggested rook c6, let me explain it. So this, well, it's a fork. I don't think they can move their rooks. Maybe a5 just. Yeah, what about a5? I just want to stop b4. So you take one of the rooks, maybe the one on the edge, and then what? Where is your compensation? You can try to attack my knight with something like that. Oh, I don't believe in it. So there is 94 always. Let me bring my king to the game. So there is 94. I can exchange the knights. Maybe I'd better start with this move actually. Take, then what? Rook d5, f6. c5, yeah, I just win this pawn. I can bring my king to the place of action. I can, yeah, so the other option is to sacrifice the bishop. So this rook c8. Which rook to c8? This rook to c8. Actually, any rook to c8. So again, not clear what's the point. This doesn't work. So it doesn't work. So no sacrifices. Well, there are just not enough conditions for such a tactical strike. b4, yeah, thanks. Yes, I saw what you wrote before. So yeah, b4 deserves attention. Thanks, Bartholomew. It's b4, and once the knight goes to e6, let's say, then e3, and then b5. So, by the way, why do you want e3? You can play b5 right away. e4 is not a problem. This, yes, but we retreat back and then chase this knight away with h4. So do b4 right, b5 right away. What do you think is the best reaction for black this time? Knight d4? Ah, that's the reason why e3 was required. Knight d4 was played in the game. We will talk about it. Knight g5, I think you just take and win a pawn. If they take there, okay, but you win a pawn and you have a passed pawn on the queen side then. That would probably work, but it significantly strengthens our bishop on f3. So bishop b7, rook a b8, bishop c6, attacking the rook. And if in this position they simply move the rook, we win a pawn, and this is absolutely winning position. But I have a question for you. Don't you think here black has a counterplay? And if yes, then with which move? So let people think. Well, rook b6 doesn't look like a counterplay. C takes b5 and the bishop is protected. Even if black increases pressure, it's not enough. It's b4, like Brian suggested. That's right. What's the point? We attack there, but the rook is hanging. However, if, let's say, well, this move, then it's extra exchange. The bishop goes back, and the c pawn can be easily stopped. Not so easily, actually. Let me stop it with this move. There is a back rank weakness, don't forget about it. So knight d4, e3, c2 fails, right? c2 fails because of bishop c2. Knight c2 and rook d8. Knight f8 protected the back rank. Well, okay, but how? And when? So, but there is knight e8 move. This is what I wanted to show you. And now once we decide to save our knight, they win exchange back and the position becomes materially equal. So we take there, they take here, and it's unclear. Or maybe we decide instead to take there. F takes e6, the knight goes to a4, and again it's unclear. These pawns are weak, but they have their king closer to it. So that's why I think that this move would deserve attention, and b4 would make a lot of sense. So c takes b5 was required, but it should be well calculated. This time it would work for black if they played so, but usually bishop b7 is a very strong attack, and black is likely to experience with issues. So knight d4 was played, the move that you suggested, but take. If pawn takes, it's bishop takes c6. So black decided to take on f3, double the pawns, but who cares? White wins a pawn. So 4 versus 4 doubled is unlikely to lead to a passed pawn for black on that side. But white already has a passed pawn on c4. So rook goes there. Rooks are exchanged. The back rank is weak, so the pawn is not hanging. Knight b5. Now king f8 and the back rank is protected, but knight a7, which allows us to exchange the c pawn for the a7 pawn. Rook takes, check, king here, and this. This move, well, usually we prefer to locate our rook behind the pawn, but this time it's in front of the pawn, but it makes rook a4 impossible. If so, it's knight c8. So the goal is to try to advance it. Knight goes to d5. Knight b5. So, and here black decided to play knight c3 to exchange the knights. What would you suggest for black instead? They still have some chances, so it's not completely losing position. But black should play very accurately. And the only result that they can dream of is a draw. So no chance to win, only to fight for a draw somehow. Maybe based on that fact that this king is still on g1 and this pawn structure isn't ideal. Okay, rook c1 winning some tempo, king g2, but then what? Rook a1? To stop the pawn? I think it's still a4. You don't stop the pawn. The king is away, right? But, well, white has a straightforward plan. f5 to launch a counterattack with e4. Well, deserves attention, but seems to be quite slow. Rook c2 instead. And now if pawn to a4, it's knight e3 check. So if the king moves there, the f2 pawn is lost and there is a perpetual check at least. If instead king goes to g1, then rook c1, and after king h2, it's still rook c2 with the threat of a perpetual check. And the f2 cannot be protected with anything else, only with the king, which again means that there is a perpetual check. And you see, I'm not playing, for example, rook f1, simply because the knight is under attack. So here I play rook c2, pinning and making this capture illegal. In the game, instead, it was knight c3. So, well, he was hoping to draw the game in the rook endgame, and this is what I typically suggest. When you are a pawn down, you'd better pass the game to a rook endgame. Yeah, I said pawn endgame, rook endgame. No, rook endgame. So a rook endgame without a pawn can be drawing. Not obligatory, but you have chances. Rook a7 check. This, another check. This, and we don't exchange the knights. Knight d6 with a tempo. Rook b4, knight f5 with a tempo attacking g7. So moving here leads to checkmate. So the king goes to d8, which allows us to take the pawn on g7. Check, king g2. Knight e2, threatening with this move, and then a repetition with rook f1. Attacking f2 and with a... Is there... Yeah, probably it's quite dangerous. So let me just play a random move to illustrate it. a4, rook g1, king h2, then rook f1. And if king g2, it's a repetition. Let's say it's something else, like a5. Then rook f2, king goes there. This means king g2, so it doesn't look so favorable. But knight g3 looks like a problem. King goes there, rook f3, and this is where black can play for a win even, maybe. That's why some immediate actions are required from white in this position. What would you suggest? So what comes to your mind? Rook d6 check. What's the purpose of rook d6 check? It can be played, right? But then what? Oh, then also suggested h4 to let the king escape. Okay, rook d6 check is better than h4 because after rook d6 you can bring the rook back to d2. So the knight has to move. There is no possibility of doing this because king h2 and now they both are hanging. So no time for rook f1. It's only rook e1 can be played, which makes no sense. That's why knight goes to d4 and then you play f4. Well, you can now play f4 with a tempo. Knight goes to c6, another check, take, and knight f6, attacking h7. Can they save it? Yes, they can. They can play this move, but after knight d7, it's absolutely losing in game. So in this rook in game, black is 2 pawns down, and the king is cut off from the place of action, which now moves to the king side. Also, one of these pawns is lost definitely, without any chances. So it was king c6, and after knight h7, black realizes that he is already 3 pawns up, and even having the knights on the board doesn't help black to survive. So he resigned. What I want you to remember from this game. So let's go from the very beginning to the very beginning and look at this bishop again. Very often you have such a situation when your bishop is attacking a pawn which is protected by the other pawn. And if so, remember that undermining this pawn allows you to attack the one behind. Even if, let's say, even if they take and you cannot play this move, but you have to take on b5 with pawn or something else, doesn't matter. b7 is always a weakness, and doing such a scenario will always favor you. If you don't see a better plan, play this plan, especially in the end games. If you see, let's say, well, it's the end game and the king is somewhere in the center, pawns are here, and your bishop is attacking these pawns, think about doing h4, h5 in order to weaken this pawn structure. Because if he takes, at least you take on h7, which means you don't lose a pawn, but you ruin the enemy pawn structure and make pawns isolated. So this is a common scenario. This is another option for you when you can decide to attack the immobile pawns. Fine. So that's all I was going to tell you about the attack on immobile pawns. Okay, there is a question. What about e4 after b4, you mean? Well, if so, you are likely to lose material. So I can play bishop g2, the knight goes, and then I take on e4. So where does the knight go? If knight e6, I can take on e4. Knight a6, right, knight a6, but what the knight is doing there, a3 just. And you're likely to lose this pawn anyway. Well, there is also c5. Okay, let me, oh, well, g4 is coming. I can, well, I will add pressure and you'll lose it. But I have another suggestion. Here, after e4, what if I just take there, this, you are still a pawn down. Yes, my pawn structure isn't ideal, but I win a pawn. I don't know which of these lines is better, but they both seem to be attractive. Here, b7 is an easy target, while c4 and c5 cannot be easily attacked. Well, there is rook e5, not at the moment, of course, but there is rook e5. Not at the moment because we have a counterplay with this move, rook d8. So in case of e4, there is at least bishop g2, and the second option is b takes c5. Because bishop g2, knight a6, I would probably prefer this because this knight is on the edge of the board, and e4 is still vulnerable. Is there anything else you want me to explain? So what I want you to remember is that you should try to attack immobile pawns with several ideas. For example, very often you can just block the pawns and add pressure. Sometimes it does make sense to undermine, and this is actually probably the most common way to do it. And undermining also works in case if you are taking the pawn behind. For example, like it was here when b5 was played and the b7 was vulnerable too. Okay, so that's all for today. There will be Title Tuesday on Tuesday. I'm going to play and stream it. What else? So happy Easter to everyone. Yeah, then we are going to do a Rapid Arena on Thursday, a group class on Friday, and the next webinar on Sunday. How can we consider a pawn sacrifice in the position? Oh, good point. Well, there are a lot of factors that tell us whether we should sacrifice or not. It depends on what we get. It can be a tactical sacrifice. It can be a positional sacrifice for some initiative or for pieces activation. Anyway, it's always a compromise. You have to compare whether material advantage compensates or not other factors such as positional improvements. I actually have a webinar. I conducted a webinar about a positional pawn sacrifice, but we can talk about it maybe on our next webinars. By the way, if you have any suggestions regarding our topics for our future workshops, you can always message me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. Also, if you are looking for individual classes, you can also send me your questions there or contact me through this email. Fine, thank you for joining, and hope to see everyone next Sunday. I'm sure you enjoyed this webinar and found it helpful. See you, bye-bye.